I'm going to read this morning from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, a selection of verses beginning at verse 9. Would you listen to the Gospel of Jesus Christ according to the author Matthew? As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to Matthew, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, Jesus said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader in the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched him on the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout that district. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world. Amen. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Church, what's the best method for you to learn? How do you learn? There are a couple, what's that? Visually. I mean, that's okay. There are different methods for learning. The hard way. Matt, are you jumping ahead in my notes here? I think he snuck a peek into my manuscript here. Different people respond better to different ways of learning. The teachers here could talk about this more than I'm sure of that. Especially Kirk Vredevelt, who just retired this week after 32 years of teaching. Half of his life was spent in public education. That's worth celebrating. Congratulations, Kirk and Marie. You'll have fun this fall when life doesn't return to normal. But the study of how we learn is called pedagogy. There are different pedagogical methods for teaching, but it's really about how best to transmit knowledge to another person. And traditionally, there are 4 modes of learning. One was already named, visual. There's audio. You can learn from hearing. There's reading and writing. And then there's kinesthetic, where you got to touch and move and perform. Do you know how you learn best? Do you know your pedagogical method? When I look at my girls, I can tell you how they learn at their current stages. It might change as they grow older, but right now, Millie, who's 3, boy, she's all auditory. She's listening to everything. Kayla and I can't sneak anything past her. We'll be talking to ourselves thinking that we're talking to ourselves alone, and then all of a sudden she'll repeat what we said, and we'll say, "Oh, okay." Millie's auditory. She will listen, and she'll listen to something over and over and over and over and over again until she has it memorized, until she has it down. When we're in the car, we play a song. The song is coming over again from the back seat. Repeat the song. It's over again. She wants to listen to it over and over and over again until she learns it. Maddie, however, right now at least, she is all hands on deck. She's 1 year old. She's all kinesthetic. She wants to do it. And she doesn't want other people to do it for her. She's figuring out her world. She's been figuring out how to walk. And as she's been figuring out how to be a little human being, she wants to do all the things herself. So she will practice it. We see her practicing. Standing up, she'll just stand up and then she'll squat and then stand back up and then squat and then stand back up and then squat And she does it over and over and over again. And she's She's learning how to jump on the bed, and she'll just do it over and over. She wants to do the thing. Now, if you're like me, you learn from the fifth method of learning, the fifth pedagogical method, which, as Matt already indicated, is the hard way. Failure. Why is it so often that we learn best through failure? We do, right? Maybe you guys don't. I wish I didn't have to fail in order to learn. I've shared before that I've got 5 rules. It's on my mind because I'm talking about it at the board meeting today. I just changed one of my rules. I don't often change my rules. I've got 5 of them. One of the rules has been forever, failure is not an option, it's an inevitability. I just changed that one this week for myself. And I changed it from failure is not an option, it's an inevitability, to failure is not an option, it's an opportunity. I learned through failure, and I don't like that. Well, failure doesn't have to be a 4-letter word. How do you learn? Today we continue our series called Ecclesia. What on earth is the church? That's our focus, that's our emphasis. This has been the question we've been asking. And as we talked about last week in our annual celebration, what matters as much as the answers is the question. That's why this is the series for us at the beginning of this year. What on earth is the church? We want to ask questions, ask one of the most important questions we can ask. And yes is the answer. What is the question? That's what we talked about last Sunday. Focusing on the questions. Do you know how many questions Jesus was asked in the New Testament, in the Gospels? Do you know how many questions he was asked? He was asked 192 questions. Do you know how many he answered? 8. He was asked 192 questions and answered 8 of them. Do you know how many questions Jesus asked in the Gospels? He himself asked, not to himself, but he asked other people. Do you know how many questions he asked? Over 300. He was asked almost 200. He asked over 300, and he provided 8 answers. If it tells you what's significant, maybe asking the right questions matters. And that's why we're asking the question, what on earth is the church? So this morning we go back in time a bit to address that question. We just celebrated Pentecost as the birth of the church, but we read from Matthew 9, and we're going to go back to the teachings of Jesus that he gave prior to the administration of his Spirit to see what type of community he was establishing. So we read from Matthew 9, Jesus' calling of Matthew to follow him, his confrontation with the Pharisees, then that interrupting, hemorrhaging woman, and then Jesus raising the synagogue leader's daughter back to life. I mean, these verses are jam-packed. There's a lot happening in a little bit of time. Today could almost be like, you remember when, not when you were a kid, but when I was a kid, it was kind of popular. I would go to the library at school and pick out a pick-your-own-adventure book. You remember those? You would read a book, and then it would say, for this to happen, go to page blank. For this to happen, go to page blank. You could pick your own adventure. Today is almost like a pick-your-own-sermon kind of day. What do you want to hear today? Do you want a sermon on Jesus calling Matthew? Do you want a sermon about the argument Jesus has with the Pharisees? Do you want a sermon about this hemorrhaging woman or the raising of the synagogue leader's daughter? I should put options up on the screen and you can pick one. Or maybe there's a thread weaving its way through all of these passages. Maybe the author Matthew composed his gospel in this way because there's something significant to be found in all of these stories. If that's the case, it's found explicitly in Jesus' dialogue with the Pharisees. And I'm telling you right now, Jesus has some guts. Jesus has grit. Would that I had the confidence that he has for the confrontational abilities that he has, because he's talking to the Pharisees, and these were learned folks. You talk about learning, these were learned folks. The Pharisees? Well, they had themselves some book learning. They were the scholars of the law. The Pharisees were not your typical synagogue leader. These were the folks in Jerusalem whose lives had been dedicated to Torah. In order to become a Pharisee, you memorize the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch. How many of you guys think you could recite Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? Leviticus would be so fun to memorize, I'm telling you right now. And Numbers. Great stuff. But they had memorized massive portions of the Hebrew Bible. And here is Jesus, the son of Joseph the carpenter, born of unwed Mary from Nazareth. Remember what Nathanael asks? Can anything good come from Nazareth? The Galilean, here he is, talking to the Pharisees, and he says to them, you guys need to learn what this means. I mean, that's courage or foolish. He tells these learned folks that they need to learn something. Let me teach you something. Let me learn you something today. They need to learn what this means. That's probably insulting to them. That's an offensive thing for Jesus to say to them. And he says, you need to learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. If there's anything that weaves its way through all of these stories, it's that right there. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And that's so insulting to these Pharisees because Jesus isn't making that phrase up. Jesus isn't just saying, well, here's what God requires of you. Here's what God desires of you. He's quoting the Hebrew Bible. Jesus is referencing something very specific. Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. A minor prophet, Hosea, wrote one of the most scathing reflections about the status of God's people. If you know the story of Hosea, you know it is a really rough text. And Hosea pulls no punches against God's people. And right in the middle of the book, the prophet Hosea writes this phrase, for I desire, this is God speaking to the people through the prophet Hosea, I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. That's what Hosea says. And Jesus tells the Pharisees that they need to learn what their own Bible says. How dare he? This Galilean from Nazareth with no pedigree. Maybe what's most crazy is that this isn't the only time that Jesus will reference Hosea chapter 6, verse 6 to these same people. In fact, in just 3 chapters, if you turn the page to Matthew chapter 12, Jesus will say this, and I'm quoting from Matthew chapter 12 here, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you something greater than the temple is here, but if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Without all the context, here's what he's saying. In chapter 9, he says, hey, y'all need to learn this. Then in his next encounter with the Pharisees, he says to them, y'all still haven't learned this. I told you you needed to learn what this means, and you still haven't. I mean, come on, dude. Maybe that means it's important. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That is the theme that weaves its way through this passage. Mercy. Mercy. I can't not think of Uncle Jesse. Any millennials or Gen X in the house? Remember Uncle Jesse? Have mercy from Full House. I can't not think of that. What on earth is the church? Well, here's our response today, church. It's merciful. What on earth is the church? It's merciful. Catch this. Can I say this? Not sacrificial. Now, let me be clear about that. That might require some unpacking because sacrifice is certainly a Christian ethic. That's why we went back to the original reference from Hosea 6, chapter 6. Jesus is referencing something specific. Jesus is saying something specific. Jesus is not saying that Christians, his followers, his church, are not sacrificial. We are to have the ethic of Christ, which was to give himself up for the sake of others. and not a sacrifice. In Hosea, the prophet says that God does not require burnt offerings. That is, God does not require God's people to atone for themselves. God does not require God's people to perform these things that are going to make them appear holy before a righteous God. That is, God does not require religiosity. God does not require the appearance of faithfulness, of having it all together, of having all the answers. God does not require that his people perform all the rituals perfectly. Come dressed for worship in the right clothes, belong to the right political party, eat the right foods, go to the right places, don't associate with the wrong people. God desires God's people, rather than appearing as if they have everything figured out, rather than looking like they have no mistakes or errors or that they are without spot or wrinkle, God desires God's people to be a people of mercy. Mercy. You know, the truth is, if you want God to have mercy on you, well, then you need to have mercy on others. Jesus said that the measure we use against other people will be the same measure God uses against us. So if you're without grace, if you're without mercy, if you're quick to condemn, well, don't be surprised when God is critical and without mercy with you. Because the measure we use against others is the measure God will use against us. Is there anyone from whom we are withholding mercy? You see, what on earth is the church? The church is merciful, not looking like everything is in its right place. This whole section of Matthew chapter 9 is example after example after example of Jesus extending mercy. Jesus doesn't tell these Pharisees that they need to learn something that he hasn't learned himself. Jesus doesn't tell them to be something or do something that he isn't or doesn't do himself. You see, the first time we see Jesus extending mercy in this passage is before he even talks to the Pharisees. It's when he encounters Matthew. Matthew is the wrong guy, and he belongs to the wrong party. He does. He's a tax collector. He is a Jewish tax collector. Do you know whose interest he represents? He does not represent the interests of Israel. He represents the interests of Rome and himself. Because as a good tax collector, you always skim a little bit off the top. Jesus says to that guy, hey, follow me. Follow me. There's something to note here about Jesus' calling of Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector, and when Jesus calls Matthew to follow him, Jesus is calling him away from the life of exploitation. I read something great this week that I just had to incorporate here, that God never calls us to something without first and simultaneously calling us away from something else. God never calls us to something without also simultaneously calling us from something. We read earlier this morning in Romans about Abraham, the faithfulness of Abraham, the righteousness accredited to him because of faith. Think about Abraham. God called Abraham to be the father of many nations. And do you know what happened when God called Abraham? Do you know what God said to him? Leave your country and leave your father's household, and I will make you the father of many nations. When God called Abraham to be the patriarch of the people, he was calling him away from something else. And remember those would-be disciples? When Jesus calls them to follow him, they say, oh, yes, we will, but first, our father is dying. We'll follow you once we bury our father. He's old, he's going to die soon. Let us bury our father first. And what does Jesus say to those would-be disciples? Let the dead bury themselves. Rather calloused. When Jesus calls us to something, he is simultaneously calling us away from something else. No one can serve two masters. So if you hear Jesus calling you to follow him, maybe one of the things we have to ask is, what is he calling us to leave behind? Maybe it's not a profession or a career like Matthew the tax collector, though maybe it is. Maybe it's not to leave your family like those disciples and like Abraham, but maybe it is. It might be that when Jesus is calling us to follow him, he's not necessarily calling us away from places or people or circumstances, but from things within ourselves. Maybe when Jesus calls us to follow him, he's saying, I'm calling you to me and calling you away from your own propensities, from your own inclination towards covetousness, or from anger, or from confusion. When God calls us to something, he calls us from something. And so Jesus calling Matthew, someone who had forsaken God's very people, to be a disciple, do you know what that was? Mercy. Mercy for one who shouldn't belong. Similarly, when Jesus heals this hemorrhaging woman, it's mercy. I mean, this was rather rude of her, if you think about it. Here's the thing about when Jesus heals this bleeding woman. According to the religious custom of the day, you weren't allowed to touch people who were bleeding. You remember Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament that those Pharisees had memorized? It says in the Pentateuch that if you make contact with a woman on her period, you are ceremonially unclean. According to the religious system of that day, Jesus would be made unclean by touching her or by being touched by her. You see, the religion of that day said that her uncleanliness would be contagious. I think ours does too sometimes. I don't think we're all that different. See, they believed that the uncleanliness of this woman would be contagious to those who were clean. And I think that's how we operate sometimes too, that the people that we think are unclean are going to infect us. And we have to shield ourselves and protect ourselves from those who are considered culturally unclean, lest they contaminate. But Jesus, in his mercy, reveals that it isn't the uncleanliness of this hemorrhaging woman that's contagious. No, you know what's contagious? The righteousness of Jesus. In this interaction with this bleeding woman, Jesus says it is not her uncleanliness that is contagious. It is my holiness that is contagious. One lesson here is that maybe we need to stop worrying so much that we're going to be infected by the world. And maybe we start sharing our life with the world because it's Jesus' mercy that will be contagious. And maybe it's a lack of faith in a good God that says, well, we can't touch these people who are unclean, lest we be made clean, as if God is not greater. Despite the religious expectation that he would be made unclean, do you know what happens? She is still made well. She's restored. She's restored to community. You know, that's what happens to her. For 12 years, she has been unable to participate in the religious life She can't worship. She's not allowed in the synagogue. She's restored to a religious community. Jesus isn't offended. He's not disgusted. And he's not put out by her. Surprised? Yeah, he is. Who touched me? And do you know what he says to her after he's surprised by her touching him? Hey, go on. Your faith has made you well. You're good. Who are the unclean in our world? Who are those that we are afraid are infecting us? Because maybe those are the ones that Jesus is ready to show mercy to. The truth is, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has many harsh words. Read through the Gospel of Matthew and see how harsh Jesus' language can be. But yet, in the whole Gospel of Matthew, not one of those harsh words is directed at sinners. And this woman would fit the bill for sinners. Remember, Jesus said, I came not for the well, but for the sick. And then lastly, with the raising of the synagogue leader's daughter, what does Jesus do? He extends mercy. Like the bleeding woman who interrupts Jesus' healing, the healing of this daughter, the synagogue leader, is asking Jesus to make himself unclean for the sake of his family. You know, a synagogue leader is not a Pharisee. This is probably like a local church pastor, someone who does not have all the education of the Pharisee, small-town synagogue leader, but someone who knew the law and led a congregation. And he tells Jesus that his daughter has just died. And what he says to her next is kind of shocking. Hey, she's just died. Will you come and lay hands on her? Because if you just touch her, I know she will live. Do you know what he's asking Jesus to do? It's not against the law. It's not against the law. But it is something that would similarly make Jesus unclean. You don't touch corpses. You have to go through a ritual of purification after touching a dead body. That would make Jesus ceremonial unclean, and he would have to go through ritual purification. The synagogue leader is asking Jesus to make himself unclean for the sake of his family. He has no obligation to do this. You know, he can hide behind the book. Oh, I would, but the Bible says I'm going to be unclean, and I got a really important meeting this week. I can't be holed up for a week unclean. I can't go through ritual purification this week. It's not a good week for me. The synagogue leader is asking Jesus to make himself unclean. And Jesus says, okay, I'll be unclean for you. It's kind of shocking that the synagogue leader asks him to do this, but Jesus does. Jesus extends mercy, and that mercy looks like getting your hands dirty sometimes. Being with and for those who are considered unclean. Would that we were a little less clean. Would that the church, when asked to make ourselves unclean, would say, okay. Because that's mercy. And all of these verses display mercy. That's the thread that's weaving its way through Matthew chapter 9. And they reveal that mercy is contagious. You know what's not contagious? Tax collecting. You know what's not contagious? Bleeding. Do you know what's not contagious? Death is not contagious. You know what is contagious? Mercy, grace, presence. See, life is contagious. What on earth is the church? Well, the church is merciful. The church is merciful, not full of condemnation or criticism or castigation or vilification. The church is a place of mercy. And I'm gonna wrap things up for us this morning, but there's just one thing before I close today. Jesus tells the Pharisees that they need to learn the meaning of the phrase, God desires mercy, not sacrifice. And I began the message by talking about learning, and that's how I want to end it today, because when Jesus is telling them they need to learn what that means, that's a very specific thing that he's saying to them. Because that word for learn in Greek, it shares the same root as another important word in the New Testament. When Jesus calls people to be his followers, what do we call them? When they follow Jesus, what do they become? Disciples, right? He has 12 of them. Actually, at one point, he had a whole lot of them. Disciples. Jesus' followers are called his disciples. They are those who seek to live their life like Jesus. A disciple was someone who emulated the patterns and lifestyles of their rabbi. Discipleship is not just about getting head knowledge, it's about foot knowledge. It's about walking in the ways of your rabbi, walking where Jesus walked, loving who Jesus loved, extending grace and mercy like Jesus did. And the word for learn in Matthew chapter 9 that Jesus says to the Pharisees is that same word for discipleship. It's the same word as disciple, just a different form of it. You see, when Jesus tells these Pharisees that they need to learn what Hosea 6:6 actually means, he's telling them that they don't need head knowledge about what the word mercy means. He's not saying, hey, go on Wikipedia, look up the word mercy, tell me what the definition is, and then you're good to go. He's not telling them that they need to find what the definition of the word mercy is. He's telling them that they need to be formed in such a way that their lives will exhibit mercy. Go and learn what this means. Go and disciple what this means. He's saying, put mercy into practice. Don't just get information about it. I mean, we're pretty good at getting information on things. I can learn anything I want in about 3 minutes. Don't gather knowledge about it. Practice it. Exercise it. Live it. What does it mean to be Jesus' people? It means that we learn that God does not desire you and I to play the part, but to be a people who put mercy into practice. Full stop. That's the message. Be merciful, because mercy is contagious. And this, church, is the good news of Jesus Christ for us today.